Hello chums, and welcome to Taming a Monster, the series where I take some of Gran Turismo 7's most ridiculous cars to see if I can tweak them so that a talentless pleb like me can handle them without being killed to death. Like any common ruffian, I'm using a bog-standard PlayStation 5 controller, and I have all driver assists turned off, except for ABS. Let's see what car is trying to murder me today. A while ago, I tested the Porsche 356 with the engine from the Porsche 959. Unsurprisingly, it was rubbish. This Porsche 964 Generation 911 is the car that you should be putting that 959 engine into instead. However, it's still a 30-year-old car descended from the Third Reich, so can I make it behave? As usual, all upgrades have been fitted, including all power upgrades, weight reduction, wide body, and the body rigidity increase. No settings have yet been touched except for downforce, which is maxed, and the transmission, which has already been adjusted. It has aftermarket wheels in the standard size. Increasing the size can improve agility, but that can also make the car more unstable, particularly over curbs. The 959, 964, 911 has a front splitter for front downforce, a rear diffuser for front and rear downforce, and a rear wing. Both rear wing options provide the same downforce values, so which you pick is irrelevant. If you're interested in learning more about aero, downforce, or any other aspect of tuning your car, I have a series called Tuning for Beginners which covers everything from suspension to differential to the transmission. The test track for today was the Circuit de Saint-Curie. No idea how to pronounce it. Rear engine weight bias meant that the car had a good launch, but it fairly quickly went downhill from there. By default, most Porsches, particularly old air-cooled Porsches, have a very low ride height in Gran Turismo. Fitting the custom suspension only makes it lower. Coupled with a natural frequency that's far too soft, the wheels will hit the arches, jamming up the steering, rendering you unable to rescue any slides. This is particularly bad on long sweeping corners where the suspension is under more load. Well, fuck that. For my first adjustments, I increased the body height so that the wheels would no longer be jammed inside the arches every time I looked at a corner. I then did my usual of increasing the anti-roll bars and natural frequency to prevent body roll. Anti-roll bars were set higher at the rear, which typically helps with stability under braking. Before I had a chance to see if the car was any better, I briefly caught the Lance Stroll bug and drove into my opponent, spinning myself out. Oops. That could have been worse. When I eventually found a corner, the car was much improved, though still extremely difficult to drive. It was now capable of counter-steering, so I could at least rescue a slide, of which there are many, due to lift-off oversteer. The main issue the car has now is that it is just so twitchy. While it is drivable, the instability, particularly at high speeds, would make this car almost impossible to drive at a track like the Nurburgring. For my next changes, I increased compression, which usually helps the car deal with the curbs. I decreased camber slightly, more at the rear to help with braking oversteer. I also added front toe out to reduce lift-off oversteer and improve overall stability. I increased rear toe in to reduce power oversteer. I also decreased front downforce to help with high-speed stability. The overall twitchiness was reduced, though there was still some instability due to the front end being so light. The main improvement was due to reducing the front downforce, which made the car much more controllable at high speeds. This track, whose name I refuse to try and pronounce again, is actually a fairly good testing ground thanks to most of the corners being high-speed sweepers, which will very quickly reveal any problems with your car's overall stability. For my final tweaks, I reduced the front downforce slightly more. I also added a few kilograms of ballast weight to the front axle, which should hopefully help balance the weight distribution and improve overall stability. I also adjusted the differential. I increased initial torque to reduce agility and make the car more stable. I decreased acceleration sensitivity to send more power to the inside wheel, which will reduce power oversteer. I also decreased braking sensitivity, which usually makes the brakes feel sharper. The car was now, more or less, something that we could consider tame, at least compared to the starting point. The small amount of ballast weight made more difference than you might expect, reducing lift-off oversteer and general twitchiness to something much more manageable. It's still challenging though, and you have to be quite alert to keep on top of its quirks, but either way, it was time to take it to the Nurburgring. I made a few more tweaks to the setup after some testing, by which I mean life-ending crashes. I increased ride height even more since the car was bottoming out in the foxhole. I also added more ballast weight to the front axle to reduce lift-off oversteer and further improve overall stability. This is the best car with a 959 engine. That includes the 959 itself. While that car has the advantage of four-wheel drive, it actually hurts the car more than it helps. When four-wheel drive cars suffer with lift-off oversteer, the front-wheel traction can cause massive snap oversteer when trying to correct. Since the 959 suffers with rather a lot of lift-off oversteer, arguably more than the rear-wheel drive Porsches, it's an extremely difficult car to manage. Factor in the fairly dramatic understeer when accelerating, and the 959 doesn't actually make a very good case for itself, at least not when fully upgraded. This 964 Generation 911 is actually easier to wrangle at this performance level, since it's not quite as prone to lift-off oversteer as the 959, and once it does start to slide, it's much easier to rescue. With this car being rear-wheel drive, you do obviously have to be careful when accelerating out of low-speed corners, but it's not as prone to power oversteer as your typical front-engine rear-wheel drive car with this kind of power. While the 964 does get the added bonus of a rear diffuser, we can't really use it to the full effect, since the rear wing options don't provide enough rear downforce to cancel out the front downforce. The newer 911s have more rear downforce, allowing them to use the rear diffuser option to full effect. Either way, this 964 can still run more front downforce than the 959, while still being stable, and it also weighs less, and unlike your average muscle car, it doesn't light up its rear tyres, so it can make more of the 840 horsepower than the donor car does. In the end, the 911, 964, 959, 11, 964, 59, 969 gets a 6 minutes 16, quite a way ahead of the car its engine is stolen from. It's also faster than several other cars that are running hundreds more horses, so it's a pretty good showing all in all. So, that was my attempt to tame a monster. I hope my settings help, or that you enjoyed this video. Join me next time where I'll be driving something that's almost certainly even worse. Thank you very much for watching, and if you're feeling particularly generous, I would greatly appreciate your subscription. Take care now, and ta-ra.